What's up, guys? This is the 4th Battleship testing log featuring Dyson, Hemeta, and I also gave Indiana another look. If you haven't seen the introduction in part 1, there's a lot of context that you're going to be missing, so give that a watch first before continuing on with this video. I'm still leveling the skills of Fubiki from Senran Kagura, which will take a couple more weeks, so I don't think I'll get around to testing her. After testing Dyson and Hemeta, I also tried out a 2 battleship composition to see how it would go, so I'll be sharing my findings from that as well. At the end, I'll also update my battleships tier list with the results taken into account. First off is Dyson. She performed pretty poorly for a couple of reasons. The first is that her barrage is way too narrow. Unlike Owari's barrage, where the arcing shells always fire in the same semi-spread pattern, Dyson's behaves more like a regular volley from a battleship gun. You can look at it as an extension of her main gun. While it is pretty strong, it aims at the same target as her guns and has little potential to hit anything else. Her barrage comes out in 2 volleys, each part being very powerful. The first one is aimed before her gun's first volley reaches its destination, so if her shelling brings the enemy very low or even kills the enemy by itself, then the barrage will overkill or be wasted. The second part of the barrage is aimed before her second volley reaches the destination, so the same thing applies. Looking at Tamaki's barrage, although it is weaker by the numbers and also single target focused, it comes out in more parts, making it less prone to overkilling one target. Also, it is randomly targeted, so it has a pretty good chance to lock onto a different target from her guns, further reducing overkill. The arcing part of Owari's barrage is similar to Dyson's in that it comes out all at once and is aimed at the same target as her guns, but it covers a larger area due to its fixed pattern, and the shells that come after the arcing ones deal extra damage to all the other enemies, which Dyson is lacking. Another issue that Dyson has is that her heal is nearly impossible to activate. Her recon plane has to come out exactly when there is an enemy anti-airship on the field, and her shelling can't kill the anti-airships before the recon plane is shot down. Realistically speaking, you can just pretend that part of her kit doesn't exist. Maybe when she gets her fate simulation, she'll just heal the Vanguard regardless of whether the recon plane gets shot down, and at that point she'll become a legitimate Vanguard healer because 8% max HP per heal is pretty good, but as of right now she doesn't actually heal. The fleet ended up losing Theseus before running out of ammo, and Dyson was MVP in none of the fights. Next up is Hemeta. Her barrage is quite powerful, but once again I am reminded of why timed barrages are not necessarily a good thing. Because her barrage is desynced from her main gun, when she fires, she doesn't have quite enough AoE to actually clear the wave of enemies in front of her. Instead, it overlaps with your airstrike, which for the most part acts more like a barrage that is attached to the airstrike instead, but in general, airstrikes don't need the extra AoE nearly as much as battleship shelling does. This could be a good thing if your airstrikes need the extra help, but my fleet is set up so that everyone does their job and leaves enough space for each other to deal damage, and as a result, the timed barrages that overlap hard with airstrikes go to waste a lot of the time. What you could do is build your fleet around accommodating the 20-second barrage, giving Hie a 20-second cooldown main gun and choosing carriers that launch before and after that, but a lot of healers tend to have cooldowns around the 20-second mark with regular equipment, so it's not as easy as using a Twin 457 or a Twin 406. During the out of ammo fight, I noticed another huge issue. Her secondary guns are much weaker than all the other ships that have been tested so far. She ends up going down before finishing the node from all the suicide ships that made it through her secondary guns. EA actually has a bunch of effects that reduce the damage received by the main fleet, including one where she redirects their damage taken to herself, and it clearly worked as she was the one who went down. I wouldn't say that she's not tanky enough for the skill, because I think Theseus might have gone down even sooner if Hie didn't have those defensive effects, but the real detriment here is the weak secondary guns. Looking at the result screen, Hie's damage is not too shabby, but the run was not too spectacular due to timing issues and suicide ships out of ammo. After Hemeta, I took another look at Indiana to see if her first run was a fluke. I noticed something weird that she was doing, which is that she would aim at the battleship production over the repair ship, even though the repair ship has higher priority and both of them were on the screen. All of the other battleships would aim at the repair ship with at least their first volley, including even Indiana herself when I looked through the footage of the first run. But for some reason, she switched targets to the real threat this run. Other than that, not much really changed. Her clear times were still slower than average, but she managed to take out one 2-star Battleship node out of ammo at the cost of Unicorn. I honestly don't know why she's not worse than she looks when I watch the battles, so there must be some kind of hidden luck buff. After Indiana, I tried out a double Battleship comp to see how it would go. There are a few things to keep in mind when building a fleet with 1 healer plus 2 battleships compared to 1 healer, 1 battleship, and a carrier. First, let's take a look at what Theseus typically does. She strikes a couple seconds after Unicorn and deals a ton of AoE damage. Her airstrikes typically wipe out all the enemies on the screen, even if there are enemies that are very far apart from each other, like the 2 battleship productions on the screen right now. It would be almost impossible for a single target-oriented ship like Dyson to cover this role. Intentionally making an airstrike slower on a carrier is also easier than making guns slower on battleships because of the Aviation Manju auxiliary, as well as the fact that many of the typically strong planes are slow to begin with anyway. On the other hand, you don't really get much direct benefit on a battleship by replacing their twin 457 with a triple 460. Another issue is airspace superiority, which would of course have to be made up for in the boss fleet, but I didn't bother with it. The advantages that a second battleship has over a carrier are the fact that battleships tend to be tankier on average than carriers, the added interception, and the fact that battleships only need a good main gun, while carriers need 3 good planes for their loadouts, so they're more budget friendly. I chose Rodney as the flagship and Alvitor as the off flag because there are a couple of the best options that I tested. In hindsight, Alvitor was not the best option because her timed barrage would not contribute any AoE when she fired her own gun. I think Tamaki or Constellation would have been better. I gave Rodney the twin 406 SKC because the first battleship to strike would often target the enemy repair ship, and then I gave Alvitor the triple 460 to make her slow, and because Theseus would typically be attacking heavy armor enemies with her airstrikes. I also gave Unicorn a JU-87 because from my testing I realized that it would lead to more consistently clearing one specific pattern that was giving the fleet trouble in 3-star battleship nodes, while not making a huge difference in the other nodes. The fleet performs perfectly well on the first 3-star battleship node, resulting in a victory with pretty much no damage taken by the main fleet. In the second fight, however, you can see Alvitor's lack of AoE coming through and leaving enemies that would typically be wiped out by Theseus. The same thing happens again in the third fight, which leads to a delayed spawn of the Alba repair ship and battleship production wave, which caused Alvitor to be on the receiving end of some enemy shelling. Skipping forward, the main fleet is still hanging on after the first 5 battles, but the Vanguard is lower in HP than usual. Even though Theseus doesn't offer any direct damage negation to the Vanguard, airstrikes still clear the screen of all shelling, which could be the reason why the Vanguard's HP is lower than usual by this point. I engage a 3-star battleship node out of ammo, which the fleet is able to take on with the loss of Unicorn. A 2 battleship composition definitely works fine and can be optimized further, perhaps by using a champagne gun over the Yamato gun on your off flag, with a barrage tied to their own gun cooldown, but I think using a carrier is just more convenient. Looking at the end screen, you can see the 2 battleships pulling most of the weight in terms of damage output. Plugging the 2 ships into the categories, Dyson is going to land behind Maryland due to her total lack of AoE and not actually having a heal. Hemeta will land in the last spot, mostly because of her weak secondaries. To be honest, her damage output is way better and more consistent than most of the ships in Acceptable, but as a solo battleship, her secondaries are too weak out of ammo and the timed barrage is not the best. I'm also going to move Indiana in front of Akane, since she can somehow clear a 2-star battleship node out of ammo and Akane can't. Still don't know why though. Keep in mind that these rankings are strictly from the 14.4 testing. Moving on to the tier list. First, I'm going to move Dyson and Flandre behind Duke of York. Both of them are simple stat sticks that deal a lot of damage against single target enemies with no other utility. I'm going by the assumption that most players already have a couple of UR battleships and are only dipping into gold battleships as placeholders, in which case Duke of York as a cheerleader for UR ships is likely going to contribute more than Dyson or Flandre most of the time. If you don't have or don't want to use UR ships, then Dyson or Flandre would carry your boss fleet much harder than Duke of York. Colorado is going to be dropped altogether because upon second look at her kit, she's not as good as Nelson and Maryland for campaign mobbing, as a lot of her skills are tied to having at least one other battleship in the fleet, and even if you run 2 battleships, she's still not necessarily as good. Nagato, Meta, and Gascon are going down to B because they're not much better than the big 7s. Gascon in particular is really weak in Chapter 14, but in Chapters 13 and possibly 15, she should be a substantial upgrade over the big 7s. The concealment mechanic in Chapter 14 just really messes with her aiming more than any other ship. Owari is going to go up beside Dyson, being weaker against single target bosses because her barrage is a fixed spread, but a much better option for campaign. Tamaki will also be going up to A tier due to her performance in campaign being better than expected, and as a result of her barrage coming out in many small parts, which ends up hitting a lot of enemies and minimizing overkill. Marco Polo will stay where she is, and now I will add the new ships. I will put Rodney Meta in front of Izumo just for now, but I will be uncapping Rodney Meta and Tamaki to 125 to see how exactly they stack up to Izumo and Hood. Alvitur will go into B tier. Although she was one of the top performers in the tests, she is still inconsistent due to having RNG barrages, and probably isn't as good in other stages. Kind of like the opposite of Gascon. Constellation will be added to the bottom of A tier. She performed slightly worse than Alvitur, but her barrage has 100% proc rate, and I think it also translates better into chapters 13 and 15 than Alvitur. Patty, Indiana, and Akane will all go into B tier behind Alvitur. I'll put Hiei Meta near the bottom of B. Her damage output is fine, but her secondary leaves a lot to be desired, although suicide ships are nowhere near as big of a problem in chapters 13 and 15 as they are in chapter 14. Due to the facts that A, I have only used her in chapter 14, B, battleships are the most important for interception in campaign, and C, interception is the most important in chapter 14, I will conservatively put her lower for now, but I would not be surprised if people find a lot of success using her in every other chapter in the game. Anyway, that's the end of this log. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.